An 18-year-old girl escapes her abusive father on a rainy night and ends up in the car of the most notorious mafia boss on the East Coast. She thinks she's escaped, but she's just walked into a perfectly orchestrated trap. The man doesn't kill her. He smiles. And that's the scariest part. This is the story of two people imprisoned in different prisons, one with chains, the other with power. And the moment they both realize their most dangerous enemy isn't outside. Watch to the end, hit like, and comment with the city you're watching in to let me know how far this story has progressed. The rain came sideways that night, the kind that finds the gaps in your collar and runs cold fingers down your spine before you even know it's inside your clothes. It beat against the dumpsters behind Club Meridian like it had a personal grievance with the city, with the alley, with every crooked thing that ever happened in the dark between buildings. The streetlight at the mouth of the alley had been broken for 3 weeks. Nobody had bothered to fix it. Nobody bothered to fix anything in this part of town. Evelyn Vale ran with her left hand pressed flat against her ribs because 2 of them might have been cracked. She didn't stop to find out. Stopping meant he caught up. Stopping meant the rest of the night happened, and she did not want to think about what the rest of the night looked like. Her hoodie was torn at the shoulder, the zipper busted, and the rain had soaked it through so it hung off her like a wet second skin. She had one sneaker that kept trying to come off her foot because the lace had snapped 2 blocks back. She held it on by curling her toes and running wrong, and it threw her gait sideways, made her look drunk, made her look like every other broken thing stumbling through the back streets of Harrow Port after midnight. She was 18 years old, and she felt about 140. Behind her, not close but not far enough, Martin Vale was screaming her name. It didn't sound like a father calling for his daughter. It sounded like a creditor demanding payment on an overdue account, which she had come to understand in the last 2 hours was more or less what she had become. She cut left between 2 dumpsters and pressed herself flat against the brick wall of the club's back loading area, breathing through her mouth because her nose was swelling on the right side where he had caught her with the back of his hand. The metallic taste of blood sat thick on her tongue. She worked her jaw carefully. Nothing loose. Small mercies. She listened. His voice echoed somewhere on the main street now, slurring and vicious. He was talking to someone. She heard a second voice, male, and her stomach clenched. Danny Reese, her father's bookie, his shadow, the man who had sat across from Martin at a folding table in their kitchen 2 nights ago and explained in a tone that was almost businesslike that the $50,000 could be forgiven, that there were other ways to settle a debt, that Martin's girl was, by all accounts, a fairly presentable young woman, and Martin had nodded. She had stood in the hallway with her back against the wall and listened to her father nod. She hadn't run then because she hadn't believed it was real. Because you tell yourself it isn't real until you can't tell yourself that anymore. And she had used up every last scrap of that story tonight when Danny Reese came to collect and Martin had opened the front door wide. So she ran. The cars behind Club Meridian were lined up along the service wall, high-end vehicles that belonged to the kind of men who entered through back doors and left no paper trail. She moved along them quickly, low, checking handles as she went. Locked, locked, locked. A silver Mercedes that beeped angrily when she touched the handle. She flinched back and kept moving. The 4th vehicle was a black Escalade, custom, the windows tinted so dark the glass looked solid. She tried the rear passenger door, and it gave with a soft mechanical click, the kind of door that had been engineered to open without sound. She didn't think about whose car it was. She thought about the voices still echoing at the mouth of the alley. She folded herself into the footwell behind the driver's seat, pulling the door shut above her with both hands, easing it closed until the latch barely caught. She pulled her knees to her chest and pressed herself as small as she could get, which wasn't very small because she was 5'6", and the footwell was designed for luggage, not people. Her back pressed against the rear of the front seat. Her injured ribs screamed at the compression. She swallowed it. The interior of the car smelled like leather and something else. Something under the leather. Cold metal and a faint acrid trace that she couldn't name yet but would later recognize as gunpowder and the particular chemical sharpness of recently discharged firearms. It was a smell that lived in the vehicle the way cigarette smoke lived in old furniture. Not an event, a condition. She heard Martin's voice pass the alley entrance, closer now, then fade. She waited. Her heartbeat was so loud in her own ears she was convinced it would give her away, that anyone who opened that door would hear it before they saw her. This thumping, panicked engine inside a girl who had made a catastrophically stupid decision and had no better options left. The minutes stretched. At some point, her breathing slowed. Her legs cramped. She shifted her weight carefully and watched the tinted window above her, watched the rain run down the glass in crooked streams, and tried to count to 60 in her head to give herself something to do that wasn't being afraid. She made it to 31 before the front doors of the club's back entrance opened. Voices. Multiple. Men moving with the particular purpose of people who always moved with purpose. Evelyn flattened herself into the footwell and stopped breathing. The rear passenger door of the Escalade opened. A man got in. She could only see him from the knee down. Dark trousers, custom cut, breaking perfectly at Italian leather shoes that probably cost more than Martin's monthly gambling debts. He settled into the seat above her and the suspension barely moved, which meant he was lean, controlled. He smelled of rain and tobacco and something else she couldn't categorize. Not cologne. Something more fundamental than that. Two men got into the front seats. The doors closed. The engine started, barely audible, the sound of serious engineering. "Talk," the man above her said. The driver spoke. His voice was Eastern European, slightly clipped. He was reporting something about a shipment. Containers rerouted without authorization. Someone named Grekov had made contact with the Castellano crew. And then, almost incidentally, the driver mentioned Pier 19, mentioned something found there. Someone found there. "Floating?" the man in the back said. "Yes." A silence. "Who confirmed the identification?" "Yusuf, sir. An hour ago." Another silence, different in texture from the first. The first silence had been waiting. This one was processing, decision-making, the kind of silence that had consequences attached to it. "Find out who authorized the rerouting," the man said. "Don't move on Grekov until I give the word. Have Yusuf meet me at the estate at midnight." He paused. "And dispose of the situation at Pier 19. "Yes, sir." Evelyn lay absolutely still in the footwell and understood with perfect clarity that she had made a very serious mistake. She had been in difficult situations before. Martin drunk and violent was a difficult situation. Martin sober and calculating was a difficult situation. 2 years of walking the careful geography of their apartment, cataloging which floorboards creaked, which silences meant safety, and which meant incoming. That had all been a difficult situation. This was something categorically different. This was a man who casually ordered the disposal of a body as a logistical correction. And then Evelyn sneezed. It wasn't a small sneeze. It wasn't the kind of sneeze you could credibly pretend hadn't happened. It was the sneeze of a girl who had been running in cold rain for 20 minutes with a damaged nose. The kind of sneeze that had been building for the last 8 minutes in the footwell and had finally chosen the worst possible moment in her 18 years of life to announce itself. The silence that followed was the loudest silence she had ever experienced. Above her, the man did not move, did not shift his weight, did not react in any physical way that she could detect. He simply became very, very still. Then slowly, with the deliberate patience of a man who had learned that fast movements were for people who weren't certain, he leaned down and looked beneath the seat. She looked back at him. Roman Volkov was 41 years old and had been feared on the eastern seaboard for 15 of them. His face was the kind of face that had been constructed by difficult living, not ugly, but hard in a way that went past bone structure, a hardness that lived behind the eyes, in the set of the jaw, in the particular quality of stillness that surrounded him like a physical force. There was a scar along his left jaw, thin and old, white against the tan of his skin. His eyes were dark gray, almost colorless in the low light, and they were currently examining her with an expression that contained absolutely no fear, no surprise, and no warmth. He studied the bruising around her throat, the split at the corner of her mouth, the swollen nose, the tear in her hoodie, the way her hands were flat against the floor, ready to push herself upright, though there was nowhere to go. The expression on his face moved through several calculations she couldn't read. Then, very slightly, his mouth curved. "Interesting," he said. The doors locked with a single clean click. Nobody in the front seat turned around. Evelyn's mouth was dry. Her ribs were on fire. She was calculating the distance between her position and the door handle above her, and she already knew it didn't matter because the door was locked. And even if it wasn't, the car was moving now, pulling smoothly out of the alley and into the rain-blurred streets of Harrowport, and she had nothing. No phone, no weapon, no leverage. Nothing except the blood drying on her lip and the stupid, stubborn fact of her own heartbeat. "I wasn't stealing anything," she said. Her voice came out steadier than she expected. She hated that she felt grateful for that. "I just needed somewhere to—" "I didn't ask," he said. She closed her mouth. He looked at her for another long moment with those flat gray eyes, then straightened up and looked out the window as if she were a minor detail he'd filed away for later. He didn't tell the driver to stop. He didn't tell the men in front to remove her. He simply sat and watched the city move past in the rain, and Evelyn lay in the footwell trying to determine whether being ignored by Roman Volkov was better or worse than being noticed by him. She was going to learn that it was neither, that it was something else entirely. The estate was 40 minutes outside the city core, up a winding private road that climbed above the harbor basin before flattening out behind 12 feet of security wall and a gate that opened on electronic command. Evelyn got a partial view of it from the footwell during the last stretch of road. Stone and glass, dark and heavy against the sky, lights burning in a dozen windows at 1 in the morning. Not a home, too purposeful for that. A headquarters, a fortified position dressed in expensive furniture. The car stopped. The driver opened the rear door. Roman stepped out. Evelyn stayed where she was, calculating, and then one of the men in the front, broad, quiet, with the flat effect of a person who had done violent things so many times they had become administrative, opened her door and stood to the side, not touching her, not threatening her, simply making clear that the car was no longer an option. She got out. The rain had thinned to a mist up here. The air smelled like the harbor, salt and diesel and cold, but cleaner than the city. Roman was already walking toward the entrance. He didn't look back. "Follow," the quiet man said. She followed. Inside, the house was what she expected. Marble and dark wood, armed men stationed at intervals, a controlled quiet that was more unsettling than noise. She counted 4 visible guards in the entrance hall, assumed twice that many she couldn't see, looked for exits the way she'd learned to look for exits, automatically, categorizing them without appearing to. Roman spoke briefly to a woman who appeared from a side corridor, mid-40s, severe, the kind of face that had decided long ago that its only job was efficiency. He gave instructions Evelyn couldn't hear, then walked down the hallway without another glance in her direction. The woman looked at Evelyn with a frank, assessing gaze. "You need the bathroom," she said. It wasn't a question. Evelyn became suddenly aware of how she looked, how she smelled. She was soaked through, bleeding, and had been folded into a car footwell for 40 minutes. "Yes," she said. The woman led her to a room on the 2nd floor. It was large by any standard she had known. Her entire apartment could have fit inside it twice. A private bathroom, clean towels, a closet with clothes that appeared to have been placed there not recently but long enough ago that there was a thin layer of dust on the upper shelf. Whoever these clothes had belonged to, they weren't coming back for them. The woman pointed to the bathroom. "There are things under the sink for your face," she said. "A doctor will come tomorrow to look at the ribs." Evelyn stopped. "How do you know about my ribs?" The woman looked at her as though the question were naive. "Mr. Volkov notices things," she said. Then she left. Evelyn heard the door lock from the outside. She stood in the center of the room for a long time, dripping onto expensive flooring, listening to the hum of the building around her, voices somewhere below, a door closing, the distant sound of men moving through a large space with purpose. Then she went to the window. The harbor spread out below in the dark, dotted with the lights of cargo ships sitting at anchor in the rain. Somewhere out there was Pier 19. Somewhere out there was a situation being disposed of. Somewhere in the city was Martin Vale, still drunk, still looking, still believing she was a thing he owned. And here she was on the 2nd floor of a house that belonged to the most dangerous man she had ever met, locked in a room that was more comfortable than anywhere she had ever slept, wearing borrowed clothes she hadn't put on yet. She pressed her fingers against the window glass. It was cold, solid, 3 inches thick if she had to guess, the kind of glass designed to stop more than weather. She thought about the way Roman had looked at her in the footwell, the calculation behind those gray eyes, the slight curve of his mouth that hadn't been warmth or amusement but something else, something she didn't have a word for yet. She told herself she was safe for tonight. She told herself that because she needed something to hold on to, and it was the only thing she had. She was still telling herself that when she finally sat on the edge of the bed, ribs throbbing, mouth swollen, hands no longer shaking quite as badly as before, and looked at the locked door. She didn't know that in the room below her, Roman Volkov was sitting at a desk with a glass of whiskey, untouched in front of him, looking at a photograph of a young woman with dark hair and a laughing mouth. His sister, dead 14 months and 11 days. She didn't know that beside the photograph there was a file. The file had her name on it. It had been there for 6 weeks. And she didn't know that the unlocked door on that black Escalade had not been an accident. That in 12 years of running a criminal empire, Roman Volkov made very few accidents. That every door that opened and every door that closed in his world opened and closed for a reason. The chair was old, wooden, slightly uneven on its legs. She wedged it under the door handle before she lay down on the bed and pulled the blanket over herself without taking off her ruined sneakers. Outside, the rain kept falling. Somewhere in the harbor, lights moved slowly through the dark. And on the second floor of Blackwater Estate, for the first time in longer than she could clearly remember, Evelyn Vale closed her eyes and did not hear her father's footsteps in the hallway. That was when she knew she was in serious trouble, because she felt safe. And nothing that felt this much like safety had ever been safe at all. The morning came in gray and indifferent, the way mornings did in Harrowport regardless of what had happened the night before. The harbor fog sat low against the water and pressed itself against the estate windows like it was trying to see inside. Evelyn woke on top of the blanket with both sneakers still on her feet and the wooden chair still jammed under the door handle, and for approximately 3 seconds she didn't know where she was. Then her ribs reminded her. She sat up slowly and cataloged the damage with the methodical detachment she had developed over years of waking up after bad nights. Right side, 2 ribs, probably cracked rather than broken, because she could breathe without the sharp, white-hot seizure that broken ribs produced. She knew the difference. She had learned the difference at 15 when Martin had thrown her into the kitchen counter during a particularly bad losing streak, and she had spent 6 weeks breathing carefully and telling her school counselor she had fallen downstairs. Her lip had swollen further overnight. Her nose was tender, but not broken. The bruising around her throat had deepened to purple-green, the shape of fingers visible if you knew what you were looking at. She went to the bathroom and looked at herself in the mirror for a long time. Then she washed her face, brushed her teeth with the unopened toothbrush she found under the sink, next to a first aid kit that was stocked with the kind of thoroughness that suggested injuries were a recurring condition in this house, and changed into the least wrong-feeling clothes from the closet. Dark jeans, slightly too long, a gray long-sleeve shirt, someone else's life, worn at the elbows. The chair was still under the door handle. She left it there and sat on the bed and waited. The doctor came at 9. He was 60, compact, with the practiced neutrality of a man who had treated wounds that weren't supposed to officially exist. He examined her ribs with efficient, impersonal hands, confirmed 2 stress fractures, taped her up with the kind of compression wrap that would hurt for 3 weeks and help for 2 of them, looked at her face without commenting on how it had gotten that way, and left a bottle of anti-inflammatories on the bedside table. "Rest," he said. "I'm being held in a locked room," she said. He looked at her the way people looked at things they had decided not to see. "Rest," he said again, and knocked twice on the door from the inside. It was opened from the outside. He left. The door locked again. Evelyn sat with the anti-inflammatories in her hand and thought about what kind of doctor made house calls to a fortified estate at 9 in the morning and asked no questions about the patient's injuries. She thought about what that implied about this place, about the frequency with which medical attention was required here, about the ecosystem she had inserted herself into by crawling into the backseat of a car she had no business touching. She took 2 of the pills with water from the bathroom tap and lay back down on the bed and stared at the ceiling and thought about Martin, not about loving him. She had stopped doing that around the time she was 16 and had run out of explanations for why love should feel the way it felt in their apartment. She thought about him tactically, about whether he would look for her, about what he would do when he found out whose car she had been in. She thought, he'll be terrified. Then she thought, terrified men do stupid things. Then she stopped thinking about Martin because there was nothing she could do about Martin from a locked room in an estate above the harbor. And she had learned a long time ago that worrying about things outside her control was a luxury she couldn't afford. It used up energy she needed for things inside her control. She slept again, briefly, and woke to the sound of voices in the hallway. Not the controlled murmur of staff going about their routines. Something sharper. Two male voices, one of them trying to keep his volume down and not entirely succeeding. The other one quiet in a way that was worse than loud. The quiet one was Roman. She couldn't make out the words through the door. She got up carefully, favoring her right side, and moved to the door and pressed her ear against it without touching the handle. Told you Grekov was a problem 6 months ago. And I told you to handle it through proper channels. There are no proper channels left, Roman. He's already talking to the feds. You don't know that. Yusuf confirmed a conversation. A conversation isn't cooperation. A pause. You move on Grekov now and we lose everything that comes after. The timing has to be right. The timing is now. Every day you wait. Every day I wait, Roman said, and his voice dropped to something that was almost quiet, almost reasonable, and somehow worse for it, is a day I'm still making the decisions. Don't forget that, Dmitri. Silence. Footsteps. One set moving away fast, the other slow and unhurried. Then, nothing. Evelyn stepped back from the door and stood in the center of the room with her arms crossed over her taped ribs, processing. Grekov. Federal cooperation. A man named Dmitri who was either very loyal or very afraid or both. An organization with internal fractures running through it like stress cracks in old concrete, invisible until the pressure found them. She filed it away the way she filed everything. Not because she intended to use it, because information was the only currency she had ever reliably possessed. The door unlocked at noon. The severe woman from the night before appeared in the doorway with a tray of food. Actual food, not a gesture toward it. Eggs, toast, coffee that smelled real. She set it on the small table near the window without ceremony. Mr. Volkov will see you this afternoon, she said. See me, Evelyn said. What does that mean? It means what it means. She moved toward the door. What's your name? Evelyn asked. The woman paused, turned slightly. Marta. Am I a prisoner, Marta? Marta looked at her with an expression that was almost, not quite, something human. You're a guest, she said. Guests can leave. Guests who arrive the way you arrived, Marta said. Stay until Mr. Volkov determines the appropriate arrangement. She left. The door stayed unlocked this time. Evelyn ate the food because refusing it would have been stupid, and hunger was not a protest. It was just hunger. The eggs were good. She resented how good they were. She drank the coffee standing at the window, looking at the harbor, watching a container ship work its slow way through the channel toward open water, and thought about appropriate arrangements. She went downstairs at 2 o'clock because staying in the room felt more like surrender than leaving it did. The estate's ground floor was more active in the daylight. She counted 11 people in the first 10 minutes, not counting the visible security at the doors. Men in expensive clothes having quiet conversations. 2 women who moved like they were calculating exits the same way Evelyn was. A man in his 60s in a suit that had nothing to do with organized crime sitting in a side room with papers spread across a table, who looked up when she passed, and then looked away with the deliberate disinterest of someone with a great deal to lose. Nobody stopped her. Nobody followed her. Nobody acknowledged her existence. She found the greenhouse by accident, through a glass-paned door at the back of the main corridor that led through a covered walkway into what had probably once been a proper conservatory. Now it was half wild, the heating system still functioning, but the cultivation long since abandoned. Plants had grown into each other, and the ceiling and each other again. A fig tree that had gotten far too large for its original purpose. Overgrown jasmine covering an entire wall. The smell of soil and green things and damp. She stood in the middle of it for a moment. Then she sat down on a low stone bench and pressed the heels of her hands against her eyes and stayed there until the tightness in her chest loosened enough to breathe around. She didn't hear him come in. "You found the one room I don't use," Roman said. She took her hands away from her face and looked at him. He was standing in the doorway of the greenhouse in a dark shirt with the sleeves pushed up, no jacket, which made him look different from the night before, less assembled. He had a cup of coffee in one hand, and he was looking at the overgrown fig tree with an expression she couldn't read. "I'll go somewhere else," she said, starting to stand. "Stay." She stayed. He came in and sat on the opposite end of the bench and looked at the jasmine on the far wall. Neither of them spoke. A minute passed, then another. "It was my mother's," he said finally. "She brought cuttings from Odessa. Wouldn't stop talking about her garden until my father built her this." He paused. "She's been dead for 20 years. Nobody touches it." Evelyn looked at the overgrown jasmine. "It's still alive. Things are harder to kill than people assume." The way he said it meant more than one thing. She let it sit. "Why am I here?" she said. Not a question exactly, more like a statement she was putting out to see what happened to it. Roman looked at his coffee. "You broke into my car." "Your car was unlocked." "So it was." "That's not an answer." He looked at her then, directly, with the same flat assessment he had used in the footwell the night before. "You're here because you needed somewhere to be," he said, "and because sending you back to wherever you came from would be—" He paused, choosing the word with more care than she expected. "Wasteful. Wasteful." "You're alive and mostly functional," he said. "That's more than a lot of people who pass through this property can say. That's a low standard. It's a realistic one." She looked at him. The scar along his jaw was more visible in the diffused greenhouse light. Up close, without the context of locked car doors and the sound of his voice ordering logistical corrections at 1 a.m, he looked like a man who hadn't slept in a long time and had made a discipline of not letting that show. "I need to know if I can leave," she said. "Not today." "That's not today," he said again, and there was no threat in it, no violence, just a finality that was more absolute than either. "There are people looking for you. Until I understand the shape of that problem, you stay here." "People looking for me?" She heard her own voice come out flat. "You mean my father?" Roman didn't answer. "You know about him," she said. It landed somewhere between a question and an accusation. He held her gaze and said nothing, which was itself an answer. Her stomach did something cold and complicated. She thought about the file on the desk she hadn't seen yet. She thought about Marta saying the word guest in the way people said words they'd been given and weren't sure fit. She thought about the unlocked door in the car. She pushed it down, filed it. "Not yet." "Okay," she said. He looked slightly surprised, as if he'd expected her to push harder. "Okay," he repeated. "I don't have anywhere better to be." She stood up, carefully, right hand pressed briefly against her ribs out of habit. "But I'm not going to stay in that room." He watched her. "Fine. And I want to know the rules." "The rules. Where I can go, where I can't, who I shouldn't speak to." She met his eyes and kept her voice even. "I've lived inside other people's rules my whole life. I know how to follow them. I just need to know what they are." Something crossed his face. Too fast to catch fully. Something between recognition and something harder. "Marta will brief you," he said. He left the greenhouse, and Evelyn stood among the overgrown plants her dead mother had brought from another country and breathed carefully through her taped ribs and thought, he didn't say no. That was the thing she kept returning to. He kept not saying no. The following days had a strange, pressurized normalcy to them. She learned the geography of the estate the way she had learned the geography of every place she'd had to navigate carefully. Through repetition and observation, building a map in her head of where the safe spaces were and where the loaded silences lived. Marta's briefing had been what it was. Certain rooms were restricted. The east wing after 9 at night, the lower level entirely. The office at the end of the main corridor, which had 2 guards outside it during the day and more at night. She could use the kitchen, the library, the greenhouse, the main hall. She was not to speak to Dmitri, who turned out to be a broad man with a military bearing and eyes that followed her with the specific quality of someone trying to determine whether she was a problem that needed solving. She avoided Dmitri. She avoided most of them, actually. It wasn't difficult. They were men who were accustomed to women in this house existing in a particular way, filling a particular function, and she fit none of their available categories. She wasn't staff. She wasn't an associate. She wasn't the kind of woman who arrived through the front door in good clothes for a purpose understood by everyone. She was something undefined, and undefined things made men in this world nervous. She found the library on the second day. Real books, not decorative ones, which surprised her. She started working her way through them with the focused consumption of someone who had always used reading as a form of going somewhere else. A history of the Silk Road, a novel in Russian she couldn't read but kept picking up. 3 volumes of maritime law she read partly out of boredom and partly because the docs kept appearing in conversations she overheard, and she wanted to understand the architecture of what was happening around her. Roman appeared in the library on the 4th evening. He stopped in the doorway when he saw her and looked at the stack of books on the table beside her with an expression she was beginning to identify as the closest he came to surprise. "Maritime law," he said. "The port comes up a lot." "Does it?" "I pay attention." He came in and sat in the chair across from her. He had a glass of whiskey he didn't drink. He looked at the book in her hands. "What have you determined?" "That whoever controls the container, manifest documentation controls a significant portion of what actually moves through the port." She paused. "And that the documentation is easier to manipulate than the physical inspection system, which means the vulnerability is administrative rather than operational." Roman was quiet for a moment. "How old are you?" he said. "I told you." 18. "Almost 19. He looked at her. "Where did you go to school?" "I didn't. Not really." She set the book down. "I read a lot." "Clearly." "My mother left her books when she left," Evelyn said, and heard herself say it with the flat affect of someone who had processed this information years ago and stored it without color. "There were a lot of them. I had a lot of time." Roman turned his whiskey glass on the arm of the chair. "Once, twice." "How long has your father been working the docks?" She looked at him directly. "You know the answer to that." He didn't look away. "I want to hear what you know." 11 years, she said. "Started as a legitimate loader. Started losing money about 6 years ago. The gambling got serious maybe 4 years back. The violence..." She stopped, recalibrated. "The violence was always there. It got worse when the debt got real. And the men he works with..." "I don't know names," she said, which was mostly true. "I know they come to the apartment sometimes. I know they're not dock workers." She paused. "I know one of them offered to make his debt disappear." Roman's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "In exchange for me," Evelyn said, and said it the way she had practiced saying it in her head. Clean and factual, no tremor in it because the tremor was private, and she kept private things private. The silence had a different quality now. "That's why I ran," she said. Roman looked at his whiskey glass. He picked it up. He set it back down without drinking. "The man who made the offer," he said. "Danny Reese." It wasn't a question. He knew the name. Something cold moved through her, slow and specific. He knew Danny Reese. He knew the name, which meant he knew her father's world, which meant his knowing her was not accidental. The unlocked car. The file on the desk she hadn't seen but felt. Felt it the way you feel a door that's been opened in a cold room before you see it. She kept her face still. "You know him," she said. "I know of him." Careful distinction, carefully made. "What does that mean?" "It means the situation is more complicated than a runaway girl in a stolen back seat," Roman said. "I didn't steal anything." "Figure of speech." "It's a tell," she said. "When people use figures of speech that aren't quite accurate, it's because they're not quite saying the thing they mean." Roman looked at her for a long moment. Long. Something shifted in his expression, barely visible, a recalibration. "You're perceptive," he said. "I grew up having to be." He nodded slowly. "Once." Then he stood, picked up his untouched whiskey, and moved toward the door. He stopped in the doorway with his back to her. "Tomorrow I have a meeting at the estate," he said. "Men will be present who are not members of this household. You will stay in your room during that time. Marta will advise you when." All right, she said. He started to go. Roman, she said. He stopped. It was the first time she'd used his name. She'd been careful not to until now, because names were a form of proximity, and she had been trying to maintain the geography of this situation with some clarity. But the word had come out anyway, her mouth making a decision her head hadn't authorized. He turned slightly. Not all the way. Why didn't you just let me go? She said. That first night. His profile in the doorway, the scar along his jaw. The way he held his weight slightly forward, always slightly forward, as if stillness was a position he maintained by choice rather than ease. Because you would have gone back, he said. I wouldn't have. Not to your father, he said, but to something like it. People go back to the shape of a thing even when the specific thing is gone. He paused. I've seen it enough times to know. Then he left. Evelyn sat in the library with the maritime law open in her lap and the lamp casting yellow light across the shelves, and thought about what he'd said, about the shape of a thing, about going back. She thought about his sister, whose existence she had pieced together from fragments, a reference Marta had made in passing, a framed photograph she'd seen through an open doorway and then not seen again, the particular quality of grief that lived in the greenhouse room where someone had grown jasmine from another country and nobody had touched anything since. She thought about a man who understood the shape of a thing. She didn't sleep well that night. The meeting happened 2 days later. Marta came to her room at 9 in the morning with the polite formality of a request that was structurally an instruction, and Evelyn stayed in her room with a book she didn't read and listened to the sound of the estate operating at a different frequency below her. More vehicles. More voices. The specific energy of men in a room together making decisions that would cost other men something. She was on her 3rd hour of not reading when she heard the voices in the hallway outside her room, not near the door. Around the corner, near the secondary staircase that ran down to the service level. 2 men speaking low, the tone carrying without the words carrying. She got up, moved to the door, opened it quietly, just enough. Move the schedule up. He doesn't know about the veil connection yet. He will, that's the problem. So we handle the girl before he does. A pause. Volkov won't. Volkov's got sentiment involved. That's new. That's exploitable. The voice hardened. Find out how much she knows about the doc records. If she can get us the location of Vale's copies, she's valuable. If she can't, and if she talks to him first, then we have a different problem. Footsteps, moving away. Evelyn stood in the gap of the open door with her hand flat against the frame, and her breathing very controlled and careful, the way she breathed when something very bad was happening, and panic was a luxury she couldn't afford. She had just heard 2 men inside Roman Volkov's estate discuss whether to use her or eliminate her. She eased the door closed. She stood in the center of the room. Her mind was running calculations so fast they came without sequence, just results. She didn't know who those men were, whether they were Roman's people or outsiders, whether Roman knew about this conversation or whether this conversation was happening specifically because Roman didn't know. She didn't know what doc records. She didn't know what her father had that someone wanted badly enough to threaten an 18-year-old girl in the second-floor hallway of a heavily guarded estate. She knew this. She had approximately as many options as she'd had in the alley behind Club Meridian 3 nights ago, which was to say almost none, except for the quality of her own attention and the things she had filed away while everyone around her had assumed she was simply a frightened girl occupying a room. She went to the window. The harbor was bright and still in the midday light. A container ship was moving slowly out through the channel. On its hull, in faded letters, a name she couldn't quite read from this distance. Somewhere in this building, Roman Volkov was sitting in a room full of men who were, at minimum, divided about what she was worth and what should be done with her. And she had been so focused on the danger she already knew about that she had not fully considered the danger she didn't. Her hands were steady. That surprised her. Then she heard the footsteps stopping outside her door and the handle beginning to turn, and she understood that the next few minutes were going to determine a great deal about what came after them, and that she had no way of knowing yet whether the person on the other side of that door was someone who wanted to use her. The handle turned and the door opened, and it was Marta. Evelyn let out a breath so controlled it barely registered as relief. Her hand stayed at her sides. Her face stayed neutral. She had learned early that showing relief was as dangerous as showing fear, because both of them told the room something about what you needed, and what you needed was leverage other people could use. Marta looked at her with the frank appraisal she used for everything. Then she looked at the room, at the book face down on the bed, at the window, at the particular quality of stillness in Evelyn that was not the stillness of someone who had been reading. "The meeting is concluding," Marta said. "You may move freely." "Thank you." Marta started to turn, stopped, turned back with the slight hesitation of a woman who had long since decided that hesitation was a weakness and kept doing it anyway. "The men downstairs," she said. "Not all of them are Mr. Volkov's." Evelyn looked at her. "I know." Something in Marta's expression shifted, almost imperceptibly, toward something that might have been respect if it had room to become that. Then she left. Evelyn waited until the footsteps had fully receded down the hallway. Then she stood in the center of the room for 60 seconds and made decisions. She needed to know who those men were. She needed to know what doc records they were referring to. She needed to know whether Roman was aware that there was a conversation happening inside his house about the girl on his second floor and what to do with her. And she needed to know all of this before anyone downstairs finished deciding that not knowing was a risk they couldn't carry. She left the room. The secondary staircase was empty. She went down it to the service level, which she had been told was restricted, but which she had also been studying for 3 days from the geography of sounds, where footsteps went, where they originated, how the acoustics of the building changed when you moved from the main structure into the service wing. The service level was where the estate's operational machinery lived: storage, maintenance access, a communications room she had identified by the particular electronic hum that came through the floor of the library above it. She was not going to the communications room. She was going to the room adjacent to it, which shared a wall, and which, based on the absence of foot traffic and the dust on the handle, was used infrequently enough that she might have 10 minutes before anyone noticed. The door was unlocked. Storage, as she had estimated. Filing cabinets, equipment cases, the particular organized clutter of a space used for overflow. She went to the shared wall and pressed her ear against it and listened. Voices. 3 of them. The meeting wrapping up the way meetings like this wrapped up. Logistics, timelines, the careful language of men who never said exactly what they meant. She heard her father's name. She held herself very still. "Vale's records are the problem," one voice said. "He documented the routes going back 4 years. If the feds get those, the feds won't get them if we find them first. Grekov's people already tried. Vale moved them. Then we need Vale, or we need someone Vale will talk to." A pause. "The girl," the third voice said, the one she'd heard in the hallway, flat and practical the way truly dangerous things were practical. "Vale will surface for her. He's already making inquiries." "Volkov knows this?" Another pause, longer, waited. "Volkov has his own interest in the Vale situation," the flat voice said, "which is why we're managing this separately." Managing this separately. She pressed her palm flat against the cold wall and thought about what that meant. Thought about men inside Roman Volkov's estate, conducting a parallel operation that Roman either didn't know about or did know about, and she couldn't determine which. She heard chairs move. Meeting ending. She stepped back from the wall and moved to the door and eased it open and went back up the service stairs at the controlled pace of someone who had not just been listening through a wall, which was a pace she had to actively construct because her instinct was to move faster. Back in her room, she sat on the bed and organized what she knew. 1. Her father had records, documents tying criminal routes through the port to specific people. This was real and specific, and multiple people wanted it badly enough to maneuver around the most powerful man in their organization to get to it. 2. Those people believed Martin Vale would surface for her, that she was bait, that her being here, inside this estate, was useful to them regardless of what Roman intended. 3. They were managing this separately from Roman, which meant either Roman was complicit and they were describing his operation in sanitized terms, or Roman was not complicit and they were running something inside his house without his knowledge. And 4, the one that sat in her chest like a stone she couldn't dislodge, the unlocked car, the file with her name on it, Roman knowing Danny Reese's name, The 6 weeks before she had ever set foot in his vehicle. She had been trying not to look at that directly. She had been filing it in the category of things she would examine when she had enough information to examine them accurately. But the information kept accumulating, and it kept pointing in one direction, and she had spent her entire life not looking directly at things because not looking was easier, and she was done with that. She got up and went downstairs and walked to the office at the end of the main corridor. The 2 guards outside it looked at her. She looked back at them with the specific expression of someone who was not asking permission. "I need to speak with him," she said. "He's finishing now," she said. One of the guards held her gaze for a moment, then knocked twice on the door and opened it slightly and spoke through the gap. A pause. He stepped back and held the door open. She went in. Roman was alone. The men who had been sitting in this room an hour ago were gone, their absence still present in the configuration of chairs and the slight residual tension in the air. He was standing at the window behind his desk, with his back to the door, looking at the harbor, and he turned when she came in with the alert, contained readiness of a man who always knew where the door was and who was coming through it. He looked at her face. "Sit down," he said. "I don't want to sit down." He studied her for a moment, then he moved to his desk and stood behind it, which put solid furniture between them, which she suspected was habitual rather than defensive, a way of defining the architecture of a conversation before it started. "Talk," he said. "I want to know about the file," she said. His expression did not change. That was an answer in itself, the absence of confusion, of the question he would have asked if he didn't know what file she meant. "Which file?" he said. "Don't do that." Her voice came out harder than she intended, and she let it. "You know which file, the one with my name on it, the one that existed before I got into your car." She watched his face. "The one that's why your car was unlocked." The silence stretched. Roman's jaw tightened fractionally. He looked at her with those flat gray eyes, and she saw him making a calculation, the same kind of calculation he always made, except this time she was close enough to watch it happen and to see the moment he decided. "Sit down," he said again. Different tone this time, not a deflection. She sat. He came around the desk and sat on its edge, which was closer than he usually positioned himself, and looked at her with the expression of a man who had decided that honesty was the more effective tool. "I've been building a case against the trafficking network operating through the port for 14 months, he said. "Your father has been a peripheral figure in it for at least 4 of those. A connector. He doesn't run anything. He facilitates movement. Container manifests, dock access, looking the other way at the right moments." He paused. 6 weeks ago, my people identified that he had begun documenting the routes, keeping records, either as insurance or because he was planning to cooperate with someone. Evelyn listened. Her hands were flat on her thighs. Her face was still. "We identified you as his closest contact, his only family." Roman's voice was careful and even, stripped of inflection, which was its own kind of inflection. "I had your situation monitored." "Monitored," she said. "Yes." "How long?" 3 weeks before that night. She absorbed this. 3 weeks. 3 weeks of being watched, of someone knowing the address of the apartment, the schedule of Martin's drinking, the shape of the life she had been trying to survive inside. 3 weeks of surveillance she had not detected, which meant it had been conducted by people who were very good at it, which meant the resources behind it were significant, which meant Roman had considered her a significant enough variable to invest those resources. "The unlocked door," she said. "Yes." "You knew I was running." "We knew your father had made an arrangement with Reese. We assessed that you would run that night." He paused. "We made it easier." The word we. Not I. We. The distance of institutional language, the kind people used when they wanted to distribute the weight of a thing. "So I wasn't a coincidence," Evelyn said. "No. I was a strategy." Roman held her gaze. "Yes." The word landed cleanly, no softening around it, no qualifications, just the single syllable sitting there in the space between them with all its weight. She had known. She had known since the library, since the names, since the file she had never seen but had felt. She had known and had not looked at it directly because not looking was a survival mechanism she had built over years of living with a man who used her, and she had simply not wanted to know how thoroughly she had walked from one version of that into another. But she had known. "What was the plan?" she said. Her voice was flat. "When you brought me here." "What was I for?" Roman didn't answer immediately. He looked at the window, then back at her. "The working plan was to use your presence here as pressure," he said. "Martin would hear where you were. He would make contact trying to get you back. In the process of making contact, he would expose the location of the records. And then you would be—" He stopped. "Released?" Her voice did not go up on the word. It stayed level, which cost her something. "Returned? What's the word you use for when the strategy concludes and the person becomes surplus?" "Evelyn." "What's the word, Roman?" He looked at her steadily. "The arrangement would have been concluded. And if the records were enough to dismantle the network, if my father cooperated, if the whole thing wrapped up cleanly." She paused. "Would I have been safe?" The silence answered. "From the people who want those records," she said, "probably not. Because I would have seen things here, heard things, been present for things." She was working through it out loud, not performing it, just following the logic to where it went. "I'm a liability either way." "That was the original assessment," Roman said. "Was." "Yes." "What changed?" He looked at her, and for the first time since she had met him, she saw something in his face that was not calculation. It was there only briefly. A fracture in the controlled surface. Something underneath that was older and more damaged than the careful machinery he operated behind. "That's a more complicated answer," he said. "I have time." "You don't, actually." He stood up from the desk. His voice shifted, the brief fracture sealed over. "The men who were here today, 2 of them are mine. 1 of them is not." She felt the cold move through her again, slower this time, more specific. "Dmitri," she said. Roman looked at her sharply. "What do you know about Dmitri?" "I heard you in the hallway 3 days ago. I heard you again through a wall an hour ago." She met his eyes. "He's running something separate from you. He thinks your interest in me is a vulnerability he can exploit. He wants to use me to draw my father out and get the records before you do. And if I'm not useful for that—" She left it where it was. The quality of Roman's stillness had changed. Something very cold had come into it. The kind of cold that preceded decision-making rather than following it. "You heard all of that," he said. "I pay attention. You said so yourself." He turned away from her and walked to the window and stood with his hands clasped behind his back, looking at the harbor, and the line of his shoulders was the line of a man recalculating very quickly. "Dmitri has been with me for 8 years, he said. "That's a long time to wait," she said. "Or a long time to be passed over for something. I don't know which." Roman was quiet. "It doesn't matter which," she said. "What matters is what he does next." Roman turned around. He looked at her with an expression she hadn't seen on him before, something that was not quite surprise and not quite respect, and lived in the territory between them. "You're 18 years old," he said, "almost 19. And you're sitting in my office telling me one of my senior men is running a parallel operation inside my organization." "I'm telling you what I heard," she said. "What you do with it is your problem." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he crossed to the desk and opened a drawer and took out a phone and made a call. He spoke in Russian, low and fast, and she understood none of the words and most of the meaning. When he finished, he put the phone down and looked at her. "I need to verify what you've told me," he said. "I know. That will take some hours. During that time, I need you to, stay in my room," she said. "Yes." She stood up. "Roman." She said his name again and again. It came out without authorization, which she was going to have to examine at some point when she had the capacity for it. "The plan you had. The original one. What was I going to be exchanged for?" He held her gaze. The fracture was gone from his face, everything sealed and controlled again, but she had seen it and couldn't unsee it, and he knew that. "The records," he said, "and your father's cooperation with the federal case." "So you were going to hand me back to the people who wanted to use me as currency," she said, "to get currency of your own." He didn't look away. "Yes." And what changed? He was quiet for a long moment. You don't remind me of bait, he said finally. The words came out without the careful construction of his usual speech, slightly rough at the edges, like something said rather than delivered. You remind me of someone who has been surviving inside other people's wars their entire life and has gotten very good at it and is very tired. She felt something move through her chest that she didn't have a name for and didn't want one. That's not a reason to change a plan, she said. No, he agreed. It isn't. She left the office. She went up the stairs and down the hallway and into her room and sat on the bed and pressed her hands flat on her knees and stared at the wall across from her. The chair was still propped against the door handle from the night before. She had stopped putting it there after the second day and had put it back again this morning without consciously deciding to. She thought about what Roman had said, about the original plan and what changed and the way he had said she didn't remind him of bait. She thought about a man who had built his entire existence around strategic control, who had watched his sister die because she had loved the wrong person in the wrong world, who had learned to treat every human being as a variable in a calculation, and what it meant that he had just told her, in the flat language of someone who rarely told anyone anything, that the calculation had changed. She thought, I should be afraid of that. She thought, I was afraid of it before I knew it was deliberate. Now it's just... She didn't finish the thought. She heard the shot from somewhere in the East Wing, a single report muffled by walls and distance, but unmistakable. Then silence. Then the sound of the estate's controlled activity breaking apart into something uncontrolled, feet moving fast, voices clipped and urgent, the entire machine shifting out of its operational rhythm into something reactive. She was at the door before she had consciously decided to move. The hallway was filling with men moving toward the East Wing. Nobody was moving toward her. She went to the top of the main staircase and looked down. Marta was crossing the entrance hall below at speed, face tight. Two of the regular guards had abandoned their positions and were moving toward the east corridor. She went down the stairs. She found Roman in the entrance hall, coming from the East Wing with blood on his shirt. Not his, she assessed from the way he was moving, from the absence of the particular careful quality people had when they were injured and managing it. He was on the phone, speaking rapidly, and his face had the quality of absolute controlled fury that she recognized as more dangerous than any version of open anger she had ever seen. He saw her. He ended the call. Get back upstairs, he said. What happened? Evelyn, what happened? He looked at her for a moment with those gray eyes that were doing very fast work behind them. Then, Dimitri is dead. She absorbed this. You verified what I told you. Faster than I expected. Something moved in his jaw. He had already made contact with the people from today's meeting. He had already given them enough to move. Move how? They know you're here. They know you're... He stopped, chose the word. Significant. Significant, she said. To me, he said. And the word came out with the rough quality again, the unengineered quality. And she filed it the way she filed everything except this one she was not going to look at directly yet. So they'll come for me, she said. They'll come for the estate, Roman said. You're one component of that. He looked at her with the assessment she had learned to read, except now there was something underneath it she was still learning to name. But yes, you specifically. She thought about the alliances outside these walls, about men who knew she was here and knew she was useful and had just watched their inside contact get removed. She thought about her father, somewhere in the city, making inquiries, desperate and drunk, and in possession of documents that multiple dangerous people needed badly enough to kill for. She thought about the unlocked car door and the file with her name on it, and the way this had never, from the first second, been anything other than a trap. Except she was starting to understand that Roman was also inside the trap. That was the thing about elaborate constructions. Sometimes the person who built them ended up standing in the center of them, too. I want to see the file, she said. Roman looked at her. The one with my name on it, she said. I want to see everything you knew about me before that night. Everything your people documented. She kept her voice even. I've been operating with partial information since I got here. That ends now. He studied her for a long moment. The blood on his shirt was drying to brown at the edges. Somewhere in the east wing, a door opened and closed. "Why?" he said. "Because whatever is coming next," she said, "you need someone in this building who knows the whole picture and is thinking clearly. Your senior lieutenant just tried to sell you out. Your organization has a fracture in it that people outside it know about and are exploiting. And you," she paused, "you made an operational decision to keep me here past the point where it was strategically clean, which means your judgment about this situation has been compromised in some direction I don't fully understand yet." His jaw tightened. "I'm not a variable," she said. "I'm not bait, and I'm not leverage, and I'm not—" She stopped, restarted. "I've been a thing other people moved around my entire life. I'm done with that. So either you show me the file and we figure out what comes next together, or I walk out that front door right now and take my chances with whoever is outside it." The silence between them had weight. It had the specific weight of a decision being made, the fulcrum moment before something tipped. Roman looked at her for a long, unreadable moment. Then he turned and walked toward the office. And the door stayed open behind him. She followed him in. He went to the desk and opened the lower left drawer and took out a folder. It was thick, 8 or 9 centimeters, held shut with a rubber band that had started to crack at the edges. He held it for a moment, not with hesitation, but with the specific quality of a man handling something that had changed its nature since he had last touched it. He put it on the desk in front of her. She took off the rubber band, opened it. The first page was a photograph, not of her, of Martin Vale and 2 other men standing on a dock in front of a container marked with a shipping company logo, taken from distance with a long lens. A date stamp. 14 months ago. She turned the page. Documentation, financial records, port access logs, manifests with annotations in handwriting she didn't recognize, names, some of which she knew, most of which she didn't. She turned more pages and the picture assembled itself, the way pictures did when you had enough pieces. A network of facilitated movement running through Harrow Port, using the legitimate infrastructure of the dock system as cover. With Martin Vale as one of several access points, human beings moved through the same channels as cargo, documented in the same ledgers, managed with the same logistical precision. She had known her father was not a good man. She had known he was connected to things that were not legal and not clean. She had told herself she didn't know the specifics because not knowing the specifics was easier than knowing them. She knew the specifics now. She turned another page and found her own name, her address, her school records, which were sparse and then stopped. A timeline of observed interactions, notes about the apartment, about Martin's schedule, about the men who visited, a surveillance photograph taken from across the street that showed her on the front stoop of their building with a library book in her hands, not looking at the camera, not knowing the camera was there. She stared at that photograph for a long time. She felt Roman watching her from across the desk. She didn't look up. "There's a second section," Roman said quietly. His voice had the careful, stripped quality of someone not certain of the ground they were walking on. "Behind the divider." She reached the divider, turned past it. The first page on the other side was a memorandum. Internal. The language of organizational assessment, the bloodless efficiency of men deciding what to do about a problem. She read it. She read it again. The memorandum outlined the use of Evelyn Vale as a pressure mechanism. It outlined the expected timeline of Martin Vale's surfacing. It outlined the expected outcome once the records were recovered. And at the bottom, in the clean bureaucratic language of operational planning, it outlined the post-operational disposition of the pressure mechanism. The word used was not released. The word used was not returned. The word used was contained, which was a word with a specific meaning in the context of men who needed loose ends to not remain loose. She closed the folder. She put her hands flat on the desk, on either side of it. She looked up at Roman. His face was doing something she had never seen it do. It was not the controlled assessment or the flat calculation. It was the expression of a man who knows he is being looked at clearly, perhaps for the first time in a long time, and cannot defend against it because the thing being seen is true. "Contained," she said. Roman said nothing. That was the plan. Her voice was very quiet. Not the quietness of being careful. The quietness of something that had passed through shock and come out the other side as something harder. "From the beginning, bring me in. Use me to find the records. And when it was done—" "That was the original plan," Roman said. His voice was rougher than she had ever heard it. Was it still the plan a week ago? He held her gaze. No. Is that true? Yes. Why should I believe that? Because if it were still the plan, he said, this conversation would not be happening. He paused. You would not be in this office. You would not have seen that file. He looked at her steadily. And you would not be standing across from me right now asking me questions I am answering. She looked at him. The harbor was visible through the window behind him, bright and cold, the afternoon light laying flat across the water. Ships moving through the channel. The mechanical indifference of the world continuing outside the walls of a room where something was being decided. She thought about the memorandum, about the word contained, about the file that had existed for 6 weeks before she climbed into the back seat of a car that was waiting for her. She thought about what she was going to do with all of it. Then the alarm went off. Not a subtle alarm. The estate's full perimeter alert, a sound she had not heard before but understood immediately from the way the building responded to it, every guard position activating, the controlled movement of the last several days replaced instantly by the organized urgency of men preparing for contact. Roman was moving before the alarm had completed its first cycle. He crossed to the desk and opened another drawer and took out a weapon and checked it with the automatic efficiency of someone who had done it thousands of times, and when he looked up, his face was the face of a man who had shifted entirely out of one mode and into another. They're not waiting, he said. No, Evelyn said. He looked at her, the gray eyes, the scar along his jaw, the blood still drying on his shirt from a dead man's wound. Stay? Don't tell me to stay in my room, she said. He looked at her for 1 second. 2. Then he reached back into the drawer and took out a second weapon and held it out to her across the desk, grip first, and she looked at it and understood that this was the moment everything became. She took the gun. His grip was cold and heavier than she expected, and she wrapped her hand around it the way she had seen done in the surveillance photographs in Roman's file, the way she had read about in 3 separate library books she had consumed in the last 4 days, because information was the only weapon she had ever reliably owned. She found the safety with her thumb without being told where it was. Roman watched her do this and said nothing. Stay behind me, he said. If I tell you to move, you move. If I tell you to stop, you stop. If I tell you to run, I run, she said. I know. He looked at her for 1 more second. Something moved across his face that wasn't the time for either of them to examine. Then the first explosion hit the east wall. The concussion came through the floor before it came through the air, a deep percussive thud that Evelyn felt in her taped ribs and in her back teeth simultaneously. Somewhere in the estate, something heavy fell. The lights in the office flickered and held. Roman was already moving toward the door, and she was 2 steps behind him, and the hallway outside was smoke and motion. The estate's remaining loyal men were moving with the compressed urgency of trained people responding to a practice scenario, which meant they had drilled this, which meant Roman had anticipated something like this, even if not this specifically, and that told her something about the life he lived and the permanence of threat inside it. 2 men fell into position flanking Roman without being instructed. She stayed close, gun down, safety on, trying to process the geometry of the building as it was now versus the building she had mapped in her head over 4 days of careful observation. The east wing was compromised. She had heard the alarm originate from the perimeter sensors on that side, and the explosion had come from the same direction, which meant the breach was staged. Distraction on one side, entry on another. That was how she would have done it if she were outside trying to get in. She had read enough about tactical entry in the maritime law book's adjacent sections on port security to know that a single-point assault was amateur work. What she was hearing now was not amateur work. West corridor, she said. Roman glanced back at her. The east explosion is a draw, she said. If they're professionals, the actual entry is... The west corridor erupted. Automatic weapon fire, sustained, coming from the direction of the service entrance she had used 3 days ago to listen through walls. The sound was enormous inside stone and hardwood, reverberating and overlapping itself, and her body reacted before her mind caught up. She dropped into a crouch against the wall, gun up now, safety off without conscious decision, heart slamming against her taped ribs so hard she could feel the compression wrap straining against it. Roman's 2 men split left and right. One of them was down in 4 seconds. She didn't see it happen. She heard it. The particular cessation of a body that had been moving and then wasn't, and she didn't look at him because looking at him would cost something she needed to keep. Roman grabbed her arm and pulled her through a doorway she hadn't fully mapped, a connecting passage between the main hall and the dining room, narrow, dark, smelling of old wood and the faint residue of cigars. He pulled the door shut behind them, and they moved through the dark in single file with his hand at her back, his fingers pressing once, twice, which she interpreted as stop, and did, while he listened. Footsteps. The wrong rhythm for the estate's people, faster, less familiar with the floor. 3, Roman said, very low. Maybe 4. Service entrance has a secondary lock, she said. Steel bar right side. Did your people engage it? He looked at her in the dark. She couldn't see his face clearly, only the outline of him, the dark shape of someone she had spent 4 days learning the geometry of. No, he said. Then they have the service level. He absorbed this with the rapid, still quality she had come to recognize as his processing mode. Not panicking, never panicking, moving through contingencies the way a man who had been doing this for 15 years moved through them, which was to say, quickly and without sentiment. There's a tunnel, he said, below the wine cellar. Emergency exit comes up inside the container storage on the harbor side. He paused. If they've done their reconnaissance, they know about it. Have they done their reconnaissance? Dmitri knew about it, Roman said. The dead man's knowledge now in the hands of the people who had bought him. She understood. How many ways in and out of the wine cellar, she said. 2 above ground, 1 below. Then we go below first, she said, before they seal it. He looked at her in the dark for a fraction of a second. Then he moved. They went deeper into the estate rather than toward the exits, which felt wrong in every instinctive way until Evelyn remembered that the wine cellar was in the lowest level, below the service floor, accessible through a secondary staircase behind the kitchen. They moved through the dining room and into the kitchen, and she heard fighting somewhere behind them now, the sharp controlled bursts of Roman's remaining men engaging in the main corridors, and the sound of it was the sound of a deteriorating situation because the engagement was moving inward rather than holding the perimeter. The kitchen was empty, industrial, commercial scale, stainless steel catching the emergency lighting in cold silver planes. Roman moved directly to the back wall and she followed, and he opened a door that she had classified as a pantry, and it was a staircase going down. The walls close, bare concrete, a single bulb and a cage fixture throwing hard shadows. She went down behind him. The wine cellar was long and low-ceilinged, bottles in racks running the length of 2 walls, a central aisle of cold stone, the temperature dropping 5 degrees as they reached the bottom of the stairs. It smelled like earth and oak, and the particular deep cold of underground spaces. Roman moved immediately to the far end without looking at the bottles, without pausing, and crouched at the base of the end wall, and she saw the outline of a hatch in the floor, iron ring handles set flush with the stone. He pulled it. It came up heavy and reluctant, hinges stiff, and the smell that rose from it was harbor water and old concrete and something metallic. Go, he said. She went. The tunnel was 2 meters wide and low enough that she had to bend at the shoulders, and it was dark except for a strip of emergency lighting along the base of one wall, dim orange, enough to see by if you moved carefully. She moved at a run anyway, crouched and off balance, gun in her right hand, left hand trailing the wall for orientation. Roman was behind her, pulling the hatch down after them, and she heard it close and heard the latch engage, and then it was just the 2 of them in the low orange dark of a tunnel under the harbor side of an estate that was being taken apart above them. She ran. The tunnel curved once, slightly, and then straightened, and she could see the far end now, another hatch, this one in the wall rather than the floor, with a bar lock across it. She hit it at speed and got both hands on the bar and shoved, and it ground open on the same stiff hinges, and the night air came in cold and salt-sharp, and she went through sideways and came out behind a stack of marine containers in the storage yard between the estate's lower wall and the harbor's edge. She pressed herself against the container's corrugated metal side. Roman came through behind her and pulled the hatch closed, and they stood in the cold dark between the containers, and she could hear the sounds of the estate above and behind them. Gunfire, irregular now, the pattern of a firefight in its final stages. And the sounds of the harbor ahead, water against the seawall, the creak of mooring lines. Roman was breathing hard. She could hear it. She was breathing hard too. Her ribs were sending sustained complaints up through her torso, and she was paying them exactly as much attention as she could afford to, which was none. "They'll have people on the harbor side," she said. "Yes." "How many exits from this yard?" "3 gates. All of them." He stopped, tilted his head. She heard it too. Footsteps. On the other side of the container stack, moving with purpose, 2 sets at minimum, the sound of people who knew where they were going. Roman pressed back against the container wall and she matched him, and they stood with their shoulders almost touching in the narrow space between the steel and the estate's outer wall. And the footsteps came closer, and she held her breathing down to almost nothing and felt her heartbeat in her jaw, in her temples, in the compressed wrap around her ribs. The footsteps passed 2 meters away. She counted to 10 after they were gone. "We need to move east," Roman said. "There's a maintenance gate near the old dry dock. It's not on any current schematic." "Because it's not on current schematics, or because you're hoping it's not?" He looked at her. Almost distantly, something like the ghost of an expression that wasn't operational. "Because I had it removed from the schematics 8 years ago," he said. "Dmitri didn't know about it. He wasn't here when it was done." "You compartmentalize," she said. "I survive," he said, and started moving east along the container row. They moved low and fast through the container yard, using the rows as cover, crossing the open spaces between them at speed and pressing back into shadow on the other side. She kept Roman's pace, which was faster than she expected from a man who projected such deliberate stillness. And she kept her gun up and her eyes moving and tried to keep the map of the yard in her head current against the reality of navigating it in the dark. They were 3 rows from the east end when the light hit them. A handheld beam, powerful, catching the gap between containers from the south end of the row. A voice called something, not to them, to someone else, the sharp 2-syllable communication of men directing each other toward a target. And then Roman was grabbing her arm, and they were running, not the careful controlled movement of before but full speed, and she heard the first shot crack against the container wall behind her head, and felt the displaced air of it, and her body went cold in a way that was not fear, but something more specific, the precise animal understanding of proximity to death. Roman pulled her left into a narrower gap, and she followed, and the next shot went wide, and she heard at least 2 sets of feet behind them now, gaining, and she thought with absolute clarity, we can't outrun them in an enclosed space. She stopped. Roman felt her stop and stop too, 3 steps ahead, and turned with an expression that was the closest she had seen him come to alarm. She stepped out of the gap into the open row. She raised the gun with both hands, stance borrowed from a library book and adjusted for the real weight of an actual firearm, and aimed at the beam of the flashlight and fired twice. The light went out. Not the man. She hadn't aimed at the man, she had aimed at the light, because hitting a moving target in the dark was not something she was going to be able to do, and she knew her limitations, but a handheld flashlight was a stationary 10-centimeter target, and she was 8 meters away, and she had read about sight alignment 3 separate times this week. Shouting. The sound of the pursuit breaking its rhythm, one of them stumbling in the sudden dark, the other stopping to assess. She was back in the gap and moving before either of them recalibrated. Roman said nothing. He grabbed her hand and she ran with him, and the maintenance gate was exactly where he said it would be, low in the east wall, padlocked with a lock that Roman hit with the base of his weapon twice, and then shot once, and the shackle gave and the gate swung outward onto a narrow concrete ledge above the harbor. Below them was water. To the right, the dock infrastructure, cranes and bollards and the massive dark shapes of moored vessels. To the left, the harbor path running back toward the city. "The dock?" Roman said. They went right. The dock path was exposed, no cover, lit at intervals by industrial lights that turned everything orange and cast long shadows that moved with the water. She ran with her jaw set and her ribs screaming and her ears tracking every sound behind them, and she could hear pursuit, not close yet, but organized, men who had regrouped and were moving with purpose. They reached the main dock structure, and Roman pulled her down a steel gangway to the lower level, the working level where the containers were moved between ship and shore. And the sound of water was loud here, slapping at the pilings beneath the grated floor. She could see the harbor through the grate under her feet. the depth of it. Roman stopped. She pulled up beside him. He was looking at the approach to the gangway above. She followed his gaze and saw them. 4 men at the top of the gangway, armed, silhouetted against the orange dock lights, beginning to descend. And below, at the dock's base, where the landside path met the water's edge, another figure, standing still, alone. She recognized him before her conscious mind confirmed it, the way you recognized a thing that had been a permanent fixture of your life through pattern and proportion, and the particular way it occupied space in the world. Martin Vale. He was standing at the base of the dock in a coat too light for the temperature, a revolver in one hand, and he was looking at her across 40 meters of industrial dock space with the expression she had seen on him her entire life, the expression of a man who had lost something he considered his property and had come to collect it. He was also, she realized in the same moment, looking at Roman. And whatever expression Roman Volkov wore for enemies, Martin was wearing it back. "There she is," Martin called out. His voice was slurred at the edges, which meant he had been drinking, which meant he was unpredictable in the specific way that drunk men with guns and wounded pride were unpredictable, which was the most dangerous kind. "There's my girl." Roman stepped forward slightly. She grabbed his arm without thinking. He looked at her hand on his arm, then at her face. "Don't," she said. Not because she was protecting Martin. She was past protecting Martin. Because the 4 men at the top of the gangway were still descending and Martin was not alone. She could see another shape in the shadow behind him, the outline of a second man, waiting. And the geometry of where each person stood was very bad. "Evelyn." Martin's voice, closer now. He had moved forward without her noticing, the way he always moved when he had been drinking, the lurching directness of a man whose internal governor was offline. "You know what you've cost me? You know what this week has? I know exactly what I've cost you," she said. Her voice came out steady, the steadiness of something that had been compressed for a very long time and had run out of room to compress further. Martin stopped. He looked at her, really looked, maybe for the first time in years, past the template he carried of her to the actual person standing in the docklight with a gun in her hand and blood drying on her lip from the last time he used his hands on her. And something moved across his face. Not remorse. Martin Vale did not do remorse. But something. Recognition, maybe. Of the fact that something had changed in a way that couldn't be changed back. "Put the gun down, Shudge," he said. His voice had shifted, the slur thickening, the confidence underneath it cracking in ways he was trying to cover. "You don't know how to—" "I shot out a flashlight from 8 meters in the dark 20 minutes ago," she said. "Don't tell me what I know how to do." The 4 men were halfway down the gangway. Roman had not moved. She could feel him beside her, reading the positions of every person in this geometry with the rapid calculation of 15 years of survival, and she could feel him arriving at the same conclusion she had arrived at, which was that the math was very bad and getting worse. "The records," she said, to Martin, directly. "The documents you've been keeping, where are they?" Martin looked at her, then at Roman, then back at her. The revolver in his hand shifted its angle slightly, not pointing at anything specifically, the restless movement of a drunk man's grip. "Why do you think I'd tell—" "Because the men on that gangway," she said, "are not here for Roman. They're here for the records, and they're here for you. Danny Reese sold you to them the same way you sold me to Danny Reese." She kept her voice even and watched his face. "They needed you to bring them here. You're not a negotiator. You're a delivery mechanism." Martin's face did something complex and ugly. "Where are the records?" she said again. "Evelyn," Roman said, low, a warning. The men on the gangway were 10 meters behind them now. Martin looked at his daughter in the orange dock light, at the gun in her hand, at the bruises on her face that he had put there, and at the expression she was wearing, which was not fear and had never been fear, which was something he had spent years trying to make into fear and had only ever succeeded in compressing into something harder. "Safe deposit box," he said. The words came out cracked at the edges. "Corner of Meridian and Dock Street. Key is—" The shot came from behind Martin. Not from Martin. From the shadow behind him. The second figure, waiting, who had been waiting for exactly this, for Martin to give up the location, the key, the information he had been carrying, and who now had no more use for Martin Vale than Martin had ever had for his daughter. Martin stumbled forward. Evelyn screamed. She did not decide to scream. Her body made that decision, 18 years of compressed grief and rage, and the specific horror of watching a terrible man get shot and feeling something anyway because he was her father and the heart was not a logical instrument. Roman moved. He moved toward the shooter behind Martin, fast and direct, firing twice, and the shadow went down. And then the men from the gangway were on them, and the dock became a confined, brutal thing. There was no elegance in it, no choreography. It was 4 men coming down a steel gangway onto a platform above harbor water, and Roman Volkov meeting them with the accumulated precision of 15 years of surviving people who wanted him dead, and Evelyn Vale standing in the orange industrial light trying to track every moving element simultaneously with a gun she had fired exactly twice in her life. The first man reached the lower deck, and Roman was already inside his reach, too close for the rifle to be useful, his left hand driving the barrel sideways and his right elbow finding the man's jaw with the short, economic violence of someone who had learned to fight in spaces where there was no room for anything theatrical. The man went down hard against the grating, and the rifle clattered and slid toward the water's edge, and Evelyn moved without thinking and stepped on it before it went over. She picked it up. She did not know how to use a rifle. She held it anyway, angled toward the remaining 3 men on the gangway, and they looked at her and she looked at them, and the calculation they were running behind their eyes was visible. An 18-year-old girl with borrowed weapons and bruises on her face and a compression wrap under her shirt, and she watched them arrive at the wrong conclusion about what she was. "Don't," she said. It came out clear, no tremor. The steadiness that had always been there underneath everything, the compressed core of her that years of Martin Vale had pushed on and had never managed to break. The man closest to the bottom of the gangway looked at the rifle in her hands and then at his 2 colleagues still on the stairs above him and made the decision to keep moving. She fired once into the gangway railing beside his hand. The steel rang. The 3 men stopped. Behind her, she heard the sounds of Roman finishing what he had started, short and brutal and final, and then his footsteps on the grating, and then he was beside her, breathing hard, a cut above his right eyebrow running blood down the side of his face that he was not paying any attention to. He looked at the 3 men on the gangway. He looked at the rifle in Evelyn's hands. "Move back up," he said to them. His voice had the quality of something that did not need to be raised to be absolute. "Back up and out of the yard and don't stop. Tell whoever sent you that the situation at this dock is concluded. Tell them that touching anything connected to this estate, this organization, or this person." He paused, the fractional pause of a man choosing exactly the right word to carry exactly the right weight. "Has a permanent cost. Make sure they understand permanent." The 3 men on the gangway looked at each other, then at Roman, then at the rifle in Evelyn's hands. They went back up. Roman watched them until they were out of sight above the dock level. Then he turned. Martin Vale was on the ground 6 meters behind them. On his side, one hand pressed against his left shoulder where the shooter's bullet had entered from behind. He was alive. She could see his chest moving. She could see his eyes, open, fixed on the grating beneath his face with the stunned animal blankness of a man whose body had just absorbed information that his mind hadn't caught up to yet. She walked to him. She stood over him for a long moment, the rifle held loose at her side, and looked at her father on the ground, at the gray in his hair that had come in since she was 12, at the cheap coat, too thin for the harbor cold, at the hand pressed to his shoulder, the knuckles scarred in the particular places that hands scarred when they were regularly used against harder objects than they should have been used against. She thought she would feel something specific, something with a clear name. She had imagined this scenario in the abstract, the version where her father was diminished and she was standing and the power had finally shifted. And in those imaginings there had always been a distinct emotional texture to it. Satisfaction, relief, something clean. What she felt was tired, a tiredness that went past the physical exhaustion of the last 40 minutes and the throbbing of her ribs and the way her hands had started to shake now that the immediate emergency had drained out of them. A tiredness that was years old. The tiredness of a person who had spent so long managing fear that removing the source of the fear left a strange, hollow resonance in the space where the vigilance used to live. She crouched down. Martin's eyes moved to her face. Up close, his color was bad, gray-white under the dock lights, sweat standing on his forehead. The shoulder wound was bleeding, but not arterially. She could see that from the rate and color of it. He was not going to die on this dock from this wound. "The key," she said, "for the safe deposit box." His mouth worked. "Evelyn." "The key, Dad." The word Dad came out with nothing attached to it. Not affection and not contempt. Just the word, used because it was accurate, the way she would have used any other accurate word. Martin flinched at the neutrality of it more than he would have flinched at rage. He reached into his coat pocket with his uninjured arm, slowly, and produced a small key on a plain ring. She took it from his hand. Their fingers did not touch. She stood up. "There's an ambulance route on the north side of the dock," Roman said from behind her. He had his phone out. "I'm calling it in anonymously. He'll be found." She looked at the key in her hand. "All right." "Evelyn," Martin's voice from the ground. She turned back. He was looking at her with the eyes of a man who had arrived somewhere he hadn't seen coming, which was its own kind of justice. "I didn't—" He stopped. Started again. "It wasn't supposed to— I know," she said. He looked at her. "It was never supposed to be anything," she said. "That's the whole problem." She looked at him for one more moment, at her father, at the man who had shaped the first 18 years of her life by what he failed to be. And then she turned away and walked to where Roman was standing at the edge of the dock, phone in hand, looking out at the harbor. She stood beside him. Below them the water moved against the pilings, black and cold, indifferent to the things that had just happened on the surface above it. Lights from the moored ships reflected in broken lines across the water. Somewhere in the estate behind them, she could still hear intermittent movement, the sounds of the firefight's aftermath being managed, Roman's remaining men consolidating. "It's not over," she said, meaning the organization, meaning the people who had sent the men on the gangway, meaning the network that ran through the port and the documents in a safe deposit box at Meridian and Dock Street and everything that came with them. "No," Roman said, "but tonight's part of it is." She looked at the key in her palm. "Those records," she said, "what happens to them?" Roman was quiet for a moment. He was pressing 2 fingers against the cut above his eyebrow, without seeming to notice he was doing it, the blood running down to his jaw and dripping from the edge of it onto the dock grating. "That depends," he said. "On what?" "On what you want to happen to them." She looked at him. He looked back. The gray eyes, the scar, the blood on his face, and the older blood still on his shirt. The man who had pulled her file 6 weeks before she ever touched his car door. The man who had handed her a gun and told her to stay behind him and had not been surprised when she didn't. "The federal case," she said. "The trafficking network. If those records go to the right people, the infrastructure comes down." "Most of it," he said. "The men at the top of it. The logistics." He paused. "Enough of it to matter. And your organization," he held her gaze, "is separate from the trafficking network. Has always been separate." A pause that was not defensive, just precise. "That was the line I didn't cross." "But you knew about it." "Yes." "For 14 months." "Yes." "And you were building a case against it rather than reporting it because reporting it to the wrong people meant it never got prosecuted," he said. "Because the men who ran the network had enough reach into the right offices that a direct report went sideways 3 years before I got involved. I watched it happen to someone else." He looked at the harbor. "So I built the case myself to the point where it couldn't be buried." She thought about this, about the distinction between a man who had done terrible things and a man who had refused to do this specific terrible thing, about whether those were separable or whether she was constructing a story that made standing here feel less compromising than it was. She thought about the memorandum, about the word contained. "The original plan had me disposable at the end," she said. "Yes, that was your plan, in your file, your handwriting on the operational notes." He looked at her directly. "Yes. And I'm supposed to—" She stopped, breathed carefully through her ribs, started again. "What am I supposed to do with that?" "I don't know," he said. The absence of a constructed answer, the flat honesty of it, landed differently than any justification would have. I changed the plan. I can't change that the plan existed. I can't give you a version of the last 6 weeks that doesn't have that in it. He looked at the water. I can tell you that the plan changed and that it changed because you're... He stopped, the rough quality in his voice again, the unengineered edge. Because you're not what I expected when I opened that file. What did you expect? A variable, he said. A daughter of a low-level facilitator. A mechanism for applying pressure. He paused. I didn't expect someone who reads maritime law for strategic advantage and shoots out flashlights from 8 meters and stands in my office and tells me my organization has been compromised. She was quiet. I didn't expect someone who looks at me the way you look at me, he said, and the words came out with the carefulness of a man handling something he had not handled before, something that didn't have a protocol attached to it. Like I'm exactly what I am, all of it, and stays anyway. The harbor moved below them. A ship's horn sounded somewhere out in the channel, distant and low, the sound of the world continuing its enormous indifferent business. I'm not staying because I'm not afraid of you, she said finally. I'm staying because I don't have anywhere else to be yet, and because... She stopped, looked at the key in her hand. And because unfinished things bother me. He looked at her. The records, she said. I'll give them to you. You finish building the case and you get them to the federal prosecutor who was handling this 3 years ago before it went sideways. I read his name in your file. He's still active. She looked at Roman. You do that, and it's done clean. And in exchange. Not an exchange, she said. Just what needs to happen. He was quiet for a moment. Then he nodded once, the way he nodded when he had decided something. All right. The ambulance arrived at the North Dock entrance 11 minutes later. She knew because she counted. She stood at the harbor's edge and listened to it arrive and did not go back to look. Roman stood beside her and also did not go back to look. And that was a thing she noted and filed in the category of things she was still learning what to do with. They went back through the maintenance gate and across the container yard and through the estate's lower entrance as the last of Roman's men were finishing what needed to be finished in the aftermath of the assault. 3 of his people had been killed. 12 attackers had been neutralized, which was a word she had heard Roman use and had understood immediately as the operational language of a world where the alternative language was too heavy to carry through every transaction. She didn't ask him how many of those 12 were dead and how many weren't. She already knew the answer wasn't going to be comfortable, and she had a limited budget for discomfort tonight. The estate stood damaged but intact. The east wall had a hole in it that had been covered with a steel panel by the time she walked past it, the estate's maintenance capacity apparently extending to rapid structural patching. The main corridor had 2 windows blown out and a section of the marble flooring that would need to be replaced. Marta was directing the cleaning of the hallway outside the office, with the expression of a woman deeply aggrieved by the inconvenience of other people's violence in her domain. She looked up when Evelyn passed. "You're bleeding," Marta said. Evelyn looked down. Her left arm, just below the elbow, a graze she hadn't noticed from something on the dock. The adrenaline had been efficient about concealing it. Now that it was pointed out, it announced itself with some enthusiasm. "Yes," she said. Marta made a sound that was the closest she came to expressing emotion and went for the first aid kit. Evelyn sat in the hallway on a chair that had been moved there for no apparent reason and let Marta clean and dress the grays with the same brisk impersonality she brought to everything, and looked at the damaged corridor of the estate and thought about the first time she had walked through it 4 days ago, soaking wet, with a broken nose and cracked ribs, memorizing exits. She thought, 4 days. She thought, it feels like a different life. Roman appeared at the end of the corridor and walked toward her and crouched in front of her chair in a way that was not quite characteristic of how he normally moved through space. The deliberate crouch of a man who wanted to be at eye level for something. She looked at him. "The doctor will come back tonight," he said. "Your ribs? I know about my ribs. You've been running on them for the last 40 minutes. I'm aware." He held her gaze. Up close, in the corridor lighting, the cut above his eyebrow had stopped bleeding and had started the process of closing, and the bruising around it was already forming, and he looked like a man who had been in a fight because he had been in a fight. And there was something almost clarifying about the absence of the polished control he usually wore. He looked human, specifically and concretely human. The safe deposit box, he said. Tomorrow, when you're able. Tomorrow, she agreed. He looked at her for a moment longer. Then he stood, which brought him back to his full height, and she stood too because sitting while he stood was a positional dynamic she had never been comfortable with and wasn't going to start being comfortable with now. They stood in the damaged hallway while Marta packed up the first aid kit with emphatic efficiency behind them, and the estate settled around them into the particular quiet of an aftermath, the sounds of cleanup and assessment replacing the sounds of assault, the machine reasserting its operational rhythm. I need to know, she said, going forward, what this is. He looked at her. What I am, she said. In this house. To you. I need the accurate version, not the managed version, because I've been living inside managed versions of things my entire life, and I'm done with it. The hallway was quiet. Marta had gone. Roman was quiet for a long moment, and in the silence she could feel him working through the same kind of deliberate honesty he had brought to the file, to the memorandum, to every question she had asked him that he had answered correctly at significant cost to his own position. I don't have a category for you, he said finally. That's the accurate version. She waited. Every person in my life has a function, he said. Organizational, transactional, even personal relationships in this world are, he stopped, structured. There's always an architecture to it. Who owes who? What the liability is. What the exposure looks like. He looked at her with the gray eyes that were doing something different from calculation. You don't fit any architecture I have, and I've spent 4 days trying to find one that works and not finding one. Because I was supposed to be disposable, she said. Not as an accusation, as a statement of structural fact. Yes, he said, and I find that I'm not willing to operate that way, with this specific situation. Another pause, the rough edge coming back into his voice. With you. She thought about what that cost him to say. Not the words themselves, Roman Volkov was not a man who struggled with words, but the position. The admission of an irrational variable in his operational thinking, the acknowledgement that something had moved him outside his own architecture. She thought about the greenhouse, the overgrown jasmine, the dead mother's cuttings that had kept living for 20 years without anyone tending them because things were harder to kill than people assumed. I'm not going to pretend the file doesn't exist, she said. I know. I'm not going to pretend the memorandum doesn't exist, the original plan, what I was supposed to be. I know that too. But I'm also not going to leave tonight, she said. Not because I can't, because I'm choosing not to. She looked at him steadily, and tomorrow I need there to be a conversation about what that means, what I do here, what I'm not, what the rules actually are. She paused. The honest ones. He looked at her for a long moment, and something in his face settled into a configuration she hadn't seen before. Something that was not the controlled assessment or the fractured and sealed emotion she had caught glimpses of, but something underneath both of those, older and quieter. The expression of a man who had been in a defended position for a very long time and had just, carefully, not surrendered, but opened a gate. Tomorrow, he said, the honest ones. She nodded. She went upstairs. She did not put the chair under the door handle. She lay on top of the blanket in the clothes she had been wearing through all of it. The grays dressed, the ribs re-wrapped by the doctor, who arrived at midnight with the same expressionless efficiency as before, the sneakers finally off and on the floor, and looked at the ceiling and thought about the key on the bedside table. Meridian and Dock Street. A safe deposit box full of documents that were about to dismantle a significant portion of what had been happening in this port for years. She thought about her father in a hospital somewhere in the city with a bullet in his shoulder that was going to heal, because Martin Vale was the kind of man who healed from physical damage with the same stubborn durability he applied to everything else. She thought about what happened after that, about whether he stayed in the city or ran, about whether he was going to be the kind of man who faced what he had done or the kind who found the next version of the same arrangement. She thought, I can't determine that. That's his. The thought had a clean edge to it, not indifference, not the cut of abandonment, just the precise boundary of a person who had finally located where her responsibility ended and someone else's began. She had spent 18 years blurring that boundary because survival required it, required her to manage his moods and his debts and his consequences as though they were her own, required her to make herself small enough to fit inside someone else's failures without getting entirely crushed. She was not going to do that anymore. She was not entirely certain what she was going to do instead. That was the honest version. The future, beyond tomorrow and the safe deposit box and the conversation she had demanded with Roman, was not yet a clear shape. It was a space, an open space of the kind she had not had access to before, which meant she did not have much practice navigating it. She thought, "That's all right." She slept. Deeply, without the surface vigilance that had characterized every night of sleep for most of her life, without listening for footsteps in the hallway, without the compressed readiness of a body that had learned to be available for emergency even in unconsciousness. She slept the way people slept when the immediate danger had passed and the body finally believed it. She woke to winter light. The harbor was gray and pale through the window, the kind of morning that didn't commit to itself, overcast and still, the water flat and the ships moving through it like shapes in a slow dream. She lay for a moment and looked at it and felt the difference between this morning and the morning 4 days ago when she had woken in this room for the first time and counted exits. She was still counting exits. She suspected she would always count exits. That was not something you unlearned. But the counting now had a different quality to it. Less urgency and more habit, the way people checked that the stove was off even when they were fairly certain it was. Not because they expected disaster, but because the practice had become part of them. She got up. She showered for the first time since arriving. She had been using the bath because the shower required raising her arms, and her ribs had had opinions about that. And stood under the water and let it run hot, and thought about nothing for 8 minutes, which was a luxury she had not previously known she could access. She dressed in the borrowed clothes that had become, by repetition and lack of alternative, simply her clothes for now. She took the key from the bedside table and held it for a moment. Small, ordinary, the kind of key that opened the kind of lock that contained the kind of documents that had cost several people their lives and would cost more before the case that Roman was building found its conclusion. She went downstairs. Roman was in the kitchen, not in his office or the formal rooms of the estate's ground floor, but in the kitchen, standing at the counter with a coffee in his hand and a phone face down on the surface beside him, looking at the harbor through the kitchen's rear window. He was in dark clothes, the cut above his eyebrow a closed, dark line in the morning light, the bruising around it yellow-purple and honest. He heard her come in and turned. She held up the key. He looked at it, then at her. "After breakfast," she said. Something happened at the corners of his mouth. Not quite a smile. The motion of a face that had forgotten the mechanics of smiling and was attempting to reconstruct them from memory. "After breakfast," he agreed. She made her own coffee and stood on the other side of the counter, and they drank in silence for a while. Not the silence of two people who had nothing to say, but the silence of two people who had said enough for one night and were allowing the morning to be what it was. Outside, one of the estate's remaining guards did a perimeter check, his footsteps on the gravel audible through the glass. "3 people," she said. "Your people. Last night." Roman's hand on his coffee cup. "Yes." "Do they have families?" A pause. "2 of them do." She nodded. She didn't know what to do with that. She filed it in the category of things she would learn to do something with, because this was the world she was in, and looking away from its costs was not something she was willing to practice. "The federal prosecutor," she said. "Marcus Webb. His name was in the file." "Yes." "When you approach him. I want to be there." Roman looked at her. "Not in the room," she said, "but I want to know it happened. I want to see the documents go from this key into the case." She met his eyes. "I need to know it was real, that it landed somewhere real." He looked at her for a moment. "All right," he said. "And the conversation we talked about," she said. "About what I am here, what the arrangement looks like going forward. I want that today." "Today," he agreed. She looked at her coffee. "I'm going to need money," she said. "Not from you, not as a—" She stopped. "I need to find work. I need to understand what I can do that has value in a world I know how to navigate." She looked up. "I can read. I can learn fast. I can observe things other people miss, and I can keep my mouth shut about what I know until it's useful. She paused. Those are skills. I just need to figure out where they're worth something legitimate. Roman was looking at her with the expression she had come to associate with recalibration. I may have some thoughts about that, he said carefully. Legal thoughts, she said, primarily. Roman. Legal thoughts, he said, and this time the motion at the corners of his mouth went slightly further, enough to qualify. She looked at him across the kitchen counter in the pale winter light, this man who had set a trap and gotten caught inside it, who had handed her a gun and a file and the unvarnished truth in the same night and called it the honest version, who stood in a dead woman's greenhouse and talked about things that were harder to kill than people assumed. She thought about what she had said the night before, about unfinished things. She thought about the fact that she was almost 19 years old and had never in her memory felt exactly like this. Not safe, because safety was a word that had been used against her too many times to sit cleanly, but something adjacent to it, something that felt like ground. The specific solidity of standing somewhere that was not the floor of a car or the hallway of an apartment where she tracked footsteps, but a place she had arrived at by making decisions. Her own decisions, the difficult kind, the kind that cost something. She thought, this is what it feels like to have made it through. Not out. Not free in the clean, uncomplicated sense that she had used to imagine freedom when she was 15, with her mother's books and her father's debts and the exits she cataloged without anyone knowing she was cataloging them. Not that. This world did not produce that version of freedom. Nobody in it was unencumbered. Everything had a history, and the history had weight, but through. She had made it through the specific storm of the last 4 days, through the specific storm of the last 18 years, and she was standing on the other side of it in someone else's kitchen, drinking good coffee with her ribs taped and a key in her pocket, and the particular steady feeling of a person who has just discovered that the thing they feared would break them did not break them. She put the coffee cup down. I want to go to the greenhouse, she said. Roman looked at her, something opening in his expression, slow and careful. The way a door opened when the person opening it wasn't certain what was on the other side. After you finish your coffee, she said. He looked at his cup. He picked it up and finished it in one long swallow, which struck her as possibly the least controlled thing she had ever seen him do, and set it down. They walked through the estate's back corridor together, past the room where the meeting had happened, past the damaged east corridor with its steel-patched wall, through the glass-paned door and the covered walkway, and into the greenhouse. The morning light came through the glass panels at a low winter angle and fell across the overgrown fig tree and the jasmine that had covered the entire south wall with the slow persistence of 20 years of living without instruction. The smell of damp soil and green things. The sound of nothing except the harbor, distant, and the small sounds of plants existing. She sat on the low stone bench. Roman stood for a moment, then sat beside her, not at the far end the way he had the first time, but closer. The distance of people who had been through something together rather than people who were still determining what the other one was. She looked at the jasmine. He looked at the jasmine too. She would have liked you, he said. Quietly. Not a performance of it, just a fact, offered. She understood he meant his sister. She didn't ask for details. The details were his, and the timing of them was his, and she had learned in the last 4 days that the most valuable thing you could give a person who had been carrying something alone for a long time was the patience to let them offer it on their own terms. Tell me about her, she said, when you're ready. He was quiet for a long time. The jasmine moved slightly in some current of air from the old ventilation system, the small motion of living things. Her name was Nina, he said. Outside the estate, the harbor moved. Ships worked the channel in the gray winter morning. Somewhere in the city, a federal prosecutor named Marcus Webb was starting his day without knowing that a key in a girl's coat pocket was about to change the shape of his case. Somewhere in a hospital bed, Martin Vale was waking to the specific reckoning of a man who had run out of road. And in the greenhouse of Blackwater Estate, among overgrown plants that had refused to die for 20 years, 2 people who had been built by difficult things sat in the winter light and talked. Not about strategy, not about operations or records or the mechanics of survival, just talked. The kind of talking that people did when they had decided to be where they were and were done pretending otherwise. The jasmine on the south wall was blooming. Small white flowers, winter stubborn, barely visible among the dark leaves. She had not noticed them the first day. She noticed them now. She thought about what Roman had said on the dock, the night before, about things that were harder to kill than people assumed. She thought, yes, she thought exactly that. The harbor kept moving, the light kept coming through the glass. The world outside continued its enormous, indifferent turning, full of everything it was full of, the difficult and the costly and the irreversible, all of it exactly as it was. But in this room, for this hour, two people who had survived different prisons sat among their dead mother's flowers and let the morning be the morning. And that was enough. That was, for now, entirely enough.